Welcome to the Massif Impact Show. I'm your host, Taylor Reed. With me, I've got my co-host, Nathan Fort, Matthew Rowley, and today we've got a special guest, Tyler Lyman. He's the founder of Halee Solar. Very excited to have him here. Thank you for being here, Tyler.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, it's going to be great. So why don't you tell us a little bit about current business, what the day-to-day is like for you?
Well, the thing about most entrepreneurship is there's never the same day twice.
Right.
Halee Solar is an impact company, and we're really looking to change the way that people view and install solar. And so the traditional model of solar, rack-mounted solar, 85% of solar is sold door-to-door. 70% of the cost of traditional solar is sales, marketing, and distribution commission. And so as a result, it's still a fairly assertive sales process. Less than 2% of the country has solar on their rooftop today. But 40% of greenhouse gas emissions come from residential energy. And so one of the biggest impacts we can have on the environment is to shift the way we produce energy from this distributed or centralized distribution model where we have large power plants that produce energy and ship it out to homes, put more of that back onto the rooftop, make it more accessible, make it more aesthetic so that more people want it, bring the cost down, and ideally make it so that it's ubiquitous on every new home.
What's been the barrier in the past to more people getting solar? Is it just lack of knowledge, or is it the installation process? Or?
I think that there's a few things. I think that the aesthetics is a big part of it. Most people don't want big rack-mounted systems on the front of their houses. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, HOA programs or HOA organizations have restricted where you can put solar. In fact, architects are now designing homes around how do we hide solar.
Right.
And so our model's a little bit different.
Great solution for that.
Yeah, let's just integrate it in, and so that it actually looks good and looks like it's a part of the home as opposed to something that was bolted on after the fact. I think that historically, the cost it's hard to justify. While energy is your third highest expense in most households, most people spend less than 5 minutes a month looking at their energy bill, and so it's been hard to justify solar. And as utility companies continue to de-incentivize solar by taking away some of the incentives that traditionally solar has been built on, it's become harder and harder. So I think aesthetics is a big part of it. The economics is part of it. And then just getting more broad distribution, installing at the point of construction as opposed to aftermarket is another.
Which takes a lot of those constraints away.
Yeah, when people are asked to write a check for $20,000 or $30,000 for a solar system, it's a big decision point. When you're building a $500,000 home, that extra $20,000 is less of a consideration.
Right. It's built into the financing, and they just don't even think about it.
Exactly.
I wasn't aware that much of our emissions, or that high of a percentage of our emissions, came from residential.
Yeah, the energy production for residential is about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions today.
That's a big deal. And you said 2% of homes have it?
Less than 2% of homes today have solar.
That's a big deal. I didn't realize it was skewed so heavily that direction. I would have assumed commercial or automotive. I would have not assumed that high of an impact.
Yeah, energy production, most energy production today is still natural gas. There's still quite a bit of coal, and there's still even some wood fire production or energy production facilities. So nuclear is a really small percentage of our energy mix in the United States, even though it's arguably the cleanest.
Yeah, and safest by death ratings and everything.
Exactly.
What blew me away was you said 70% of the cost of solar is sales and marketing. That blew my mind.
It's a tough job. If you've worked in the door-to-door space, you go out and you bang your head against doors for hours on end, and so the compensation is really necessary to drive or incentivize those type of sales and growth. But the actual cost of solar technology has come down so much over the last 15 years. We're starting to see some of that in the energy storage space as well, where the cost of energy storage is coming down. But it's still a very assertive sales process. It requires a salesperson to go out and sell it. And on average, the salesperson's going to earn anywhere between $3,000 and $5,000 a sale. The guy who set the lead's going to earn a couple $1,000s. The install company's going to earn a few $1,000s. So a $25,000 system only has about $6,000 in COGS. The rest of it is really just sales, marketing, and distribution commission.
Wow.
I think it takes a lot of education. It's one of those sales where, and I think a lot of people are starting to catch on. It's a good thing, for your industry that it's also fairly trendy, to get into solar. But still, there's a lot of misconceptions, I think, about the expense and the benefit, and even the potential tax benefits. So how are you guys trying to tackle that, the whole education piece of it?
Well, yeah, and I think if you look at some of the ideas around solar, or some of the inhibitors for the last few years, a big part of it is really just the sales process. I think that there are a lot of fairly unscrupulous door-to-door salespeople. There's a lot of really great companies out there. There's a lot of really good salespeople, but it has a reputation as kind of a used car experience where you never quite know what you're going to get. And some of that is just the economics and economic incentive behind it. Most people, when they get solar, they think they have a lot of free energy, and so they increase their energy consumption. So I no longer have to worry about my thermostat because I've got all this free energy, and they get their bill.
It's like the tankless
month.
water heater. Now I can have a 3-hour shower.
Right.
Use all
Yeah.
use all that hot water.
Yeah, exactly. And so they get their first energy bill, and suddenly their energy bill actually went up. It didn't go down. And so there's some of that. Just the numbers can be confusing. The dynamic nature of the way that the economics work can be confusing for a lot of people. Historically, the technology hasn't been great, and so it didn't last as long as it needed to or should have. And so you have a system on your roof for 10 years, and it's no longer producing energy.
What are some of the big differences between some of those older systems and something like what Halee Solar offers?
Well, I think technology's gotten a lot better as we've done that. And
As far as durability, performance.
Exactly. The biggest difference between us and a traditional rack-mounted solar system is obviously the aesthetics and the way that we install on a roof. So we integrate with a traditional concrete roofing tile, and so we actually replace that concrete roofing tile for about 40% of the roof. And the solar tiles become the roofing element, which creates some of its own challenges. While aesthetically it looks great, heat is the enemy of efficiency. And in a rack-mounted installation, you've got this big air gap underneath it. And so it creates a lot of airflow above and below to help keep it cool. In an integrated environment, there's not that air gap, and so that creates challenges. But the technology's definitely gotten a lot better. I think we're just at this tipping point now where people are beginning to shop for solar, where historically you really didn't shop for solar. Somebody knocked on your door. They told you that they could save you $30 a month. For somebody where $30 a month is a meaningful impact to their disposable income, it was a fairly easy decision. And that's why today the top 3 demographics for door-to-door solar are still low income, fixed income, and low education, because that's where the most impact is had.
So why solar? What made you feel passionate about solar? I mean, obviously it's great for the environment. What kind of took you that direction?
Because you've been involved in other solar companies as well, correct?
Yeah, and traditional businesses before that. I got interested in solar 20 years ago when I wanted to put solar on my house, but I thought it looked ugly. Yeah. And so I actually designed the first system 20 years ago, this building integrated system 20 years ago. And I'm not a very good engineer. I'm a finance guy. And so tinkering in my garage, I built this out. And
That's pretty cool.
We put it up on the roof, and it didn't work very well. But it looked really good.
Is that when you knew you weren't a great engineer?
Yeah, that's when I knew.
He's like, so now let's start a business on this premise.
But I thought it looked really good, and I thought the only way that we were going to get broad adoption for solar was to make it more aesthetic.
Right.
You couldn't bolt something up on top of a roof and have it.
That's a deal breaker for a lot.
Yeah, for a lot of people, it's a deal breaker. And so I went off and started a few other companies around the world, and came back in 2017 and was looking at opportunities where I could build an impact business. About 10 years ago, I started focusing solely on building companies that have a third bottom line, kind of the impact that we can have on some type of a social issue. And I came back to solar, and I really wanted to do it. And I started to see the scale. I started to see the opportunity. I started to see where the market was going to go, and had gotten together with my business partner, Dan McComber, on a couple of other companies. And we decided to launch Halee Solar with the idea that we were going to change and revolutionize the way that solar was sold and installed. And so we set off with this 3-pillar mission: had to be aesthetic. We had to change the aesthetic so that it actually looked good and became a desirable component of a house. We had to change the economics. By going direct to the builder, we can reduce that commission. We don't have to pay our sales guys as much as a door-to-door salesperson because they're going to sell one builder 1,000 homes as opposed to door to door to door.
Smart.
So we can lower our costs by reducing the commission, even though our COGS are a little bit higher because our scale is a little bit lower. Our overall cost is about 30% less than traditional rack-mounted solar today.
The higher quality.
And a higher quality, and just changing the way that we could have an impact. Going door to door, having an army of salespeople that go door to door, we're getting a lot of sales coming through the traditional solar market, but it's nothing like we can get if we get builders to adopt it at the point of construction.
Yeah.
And so we created a way that incentivized builders, not just to make it another product offering, but actually financially incentivize them to put it onto their roofs and make it part of their standard product offering.
And is that using tax credits, or how does the builder look at that sort of package?
So the first thing is we lower their cost of construction by eliminating about 40% of the roofing cost. So 40% of the roofing cost traditionally was these concrete roofing tiles. Mm-hmm. Those are now displaced. We're passing the cost of solar direct to the consumer, so 40% of the roof costs are eliminated right off the top. Builders can participate in the tax incentives. We have what we call a turnkey lease structure or a tax equity fund that the builder can invest into. They get about $1.20 back off of their taxes for every dollar that they invest. And so we've got a builder that we're working with. It's about $100 million in annual contract value. They'll invest about $50 million. They'll get back about $62.5 million every year off of their taxes. And so they can participate that way. The cost savings, plus it gives them another product offering. And 3 years ago, even 6 months ago, when it was a seller's market, you were on waiting lists to buy a home.
Right.
Well, now builders are having to lower costs. They're having to create differentiation through different product offerings.
Make it more attractive to the buyers.
Exactly.
Yeah, you got to win them over now.
So, and then the fourth thing is really around where the building code is going. So the HERS score, the housing environmental resource standard, I think is what it's called. Mm-hmm. It's basically what the Department of Energy uses to measure the efficiency of a home. So the current building standard would give them about a 60 HERS score. The first time they rolled it out in 2014, 100 HERS score was the standard. If you built to building code, you would have 100 HERS score. Right now it's about 60. The goal is to have it at 0 by 2028. Well, there's not much more we can do from tightening up the envelope on a house or putting new windows and doors on it.
Yep, insulation.
And so, there's not a whole lot we can do there. So the next two things are production. How do we put more energy production, clean energy production on the rooftop? And then consumption. How do we reduce consumption through automation? And that's what our mission is really initially focused on production and how do we optimize production. And then ultimately going into using AI to look at how do we spend energy, how can we use less energy to really live the same lifestyle.
A lot of social and economic pressures kind of making solar really attractive. You know, the tax code is a big one.
Yeah.
Right? The government's paying you to put solar on your roof.
Exactly. So right now the federal tax incentive or investment tax credit is 30%. If it's an American-made product, it's 40%. Because of the way we're designed, we actually can expand what's included in their tax incentive too. So traditional rack-mounted solar, you'd get 30% off of your solar system. Because we're an integrated system and we're the entire roof structure, we get 30% off of the entire roof. And so that adds a little bit to the tax incentive. Right. So there's definitely a lot of tailwinds. At the same time, there's a lot of government regulation that's inhibiting more solar adoption. Things like the utility companies, they're quasi-private organizations that are government regulated. Well, they don't like solar because solar produces a lot of energy at a time of day when they may or may not need excess energy. They need energy in that 4 to 6 window. We're producing energy in the 12 to 3 window, and until energy storage becomes a big thing, becomes more cost effective, where the levelized cost of energy is more in parity with what it costs to buy energy. It's not as beneficial for utilities today. So they definitely push back, but we're seeing a lot of government incentives, the tax structure, the IRA, the Inflation Recovery Act that was just passed increased the tax incentive from 26% back to 30%. It extended it another 8 years beyond what it was originally scheduled for.
So do you think through working with builders, obviously instead of having 1 or 2 homes in the neighborhood with solar, now we have entire neighborhoods built on solar. So that's a huge way that you think you can move the needle to where we go from having 2% of homes to a much greater percentage. Is that the idea there socially?
Exactly. So, and our mission is to make it so that solar is ubiquitous on every new home. We're not the only product out there. In fact, if there are more products out there, it's probably a little bit better because we need more market education. And so there's so much opportunity. There's room for a number of companies in this space to be able to do it. But getting it installed at the point of construction so that it's ubiquitous and it's just standard on every new home is really how we'll move the needle.
That's great. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit here. I know before we were speaking a little bit, and you told us how you came up with the name Halee for Halee Solar. Can I ask you about that again? I'd love for you to share with people how you came up with that.
Initially, the idea was just a working title, just a working name. You know, a lot of times when you're in that ideation phase of a new company, you call it Newco or something like that. And so Halee, a little bit of the inspiration initially was the AI from Space Odyssey, Hal.
Awesome. That's pretty good, isn't it?
And so I was thinking, well, we want Hal. We want to try and tackle some AI. We want to bring some technology into this. We want to bring some intelligence into the way that we not only produce but consume energy. And so we created an acronym around it. It was Home Automation, Lighting, Environmental, and Electrical. The first thing that we're focused on is solar, but our future roadmap will take us into some IoT devices in the home that look at automation, and some AI technology that looks at consumption and some of those things. So Home Automation, Lighting, Environmental, and Electrical was the initial working title, or Halee. It was a kinder, gentler version of Hal. Right. Ideally an AI that didn't take over and kill you.
Yeah.
And so it was that female version of Hal.
Yeah.
There you go.
So
Love it.
And it just kind of stuck, and we still get questions all the time. People mispronounce it all the time, but it's just kind of stuck, and we like it.
So at what point in your life did you know you wanted to be in business? Like this was your thing. You had that mind, and
yeah.
When did you become aware of that?
You know, at a pretty young age, my dad had this philosophy that he always taught us: you live off of your job, you retire off of your project. So there were always things going on in the background, whether it was real estate or some other something else. And he'd gone through the downturn in the 1980s with real estate, and been affected like everybody else. And so he was fairly conservative. But from a very young age, we had opportunities to be entrepreneurial. I had my first company. I bought a franchise when I was 15. It was a window covering franchise.
You really?
Yeah, and so
I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Neither did they.
Where was this?
In Arizona here.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
And then after school, I'd gone and worked in corporate America. I was with a company, and we would take internal business processes, build them up into a company, sell them off, and divest them to another organization. We would become their first customer. And we did that a handful of times. One of those transactions, the CEO of the company that was buying the technology from us, they bought it for about $35 million from us. Part of the deal was that I went with the transaction. And so we're sitting in the boardroom, and she says, I think we're in agreement on everything, but we want Tyler to come. And my boss said, yeah, you can have him, no problem.
How did that feel?
That felt good.
Sold down the river.
On one side, I felt, I'm really, really wanted. I was 24 at the time.
Maybe your boss negotiated that deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've got to take Tyler.
24 at the time, but it gave me a lot of insight and access to a company. It was a privately held company based out of Minneapolis in the hospitality space. They own a bunch of hotels all over the world. We built that technology up and sold it a few years later for about $370 million. And I got a nice check and a gold watch, I think. And the owner of the company got a new Gulfstream G4.
Compares, right?
Yeah, and I realized I was on the wrong side of the balance sheet.
Yeah, wrong side of that transaction.
So,
But a watch is pretty
lesson
great.
learned.
Watch
Yeah.
is nice though.
It was a couple years later that I decided, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna continue to do what I've been doing for other people, just on my
do it for
own.
myself.
And so that was in 2006. And then about 10 years ago, I had just exited a company in China and was looking at different things to do, and had met with some guys who had done work in Southeast Asia around microfinance, microlending, and when they were talking about the benefits of social impact. And so I started to really look at and try to understand, how do we create a business that not only solves a profit mission and creates shareholder value and employee value, but solves some type of a social issue. And so created a company in China that worked on employee livelihood, and we grew that. We took about just under 60 million in venture capital to grow that business up, and we had about 2 million monthly active users on the platform. We helped about 350,000 people a year find new and meaningful employment, about 10 million hours of training, all via mobile devices. And then it was in China. My family was here. I was commuting back and forth. I was never in the right place.
It's a long commute.
Yeah, so
So
for everyone
2017
listening right now
decided-
complaining about their commute,
Yeah.
your commute was to China.
Yeah,
And
so I
how
commuted
often did you make that trip?
about every 2 weeks. I was back and forth every 2 weeks.
For how
depending on-
long?
For almost 4 years.
Wow.
Now, how long were you there in
Usually
China?
about 2 weeks.
Okay.
So I would be there for about 2 weeks, back here for 2 weeks.
So
varied a
50%
little
of your
bit, but-
time in China for 4 years, away from your family. So everybody will see, where where you are now, where you've arrived, the things you've been through, but nobody understands the journey that got you here. Was that one of your toughest times so far in your career?
China was hard from a number of perspectives. It's hard to do business in China. It's kind of like the wild, wild west. And so there was a lot of opportunity. There was a lot of, there's still quite a, there was at the time still a little bit of corruption, and it was just difficult to do business. And it was very bureaucratic. They were very warm and inviting for foreign investment at the time. They're not as much today. But at the time, they were very warm and inviting, and tried to create ways to incentivize Western companies to come to China. But it was definitely a challenge. And that business, we were scaling so fast. Our first customer was Apple, and then we went Apple, Nike, Adidas, Disney, and a handful of others. And so we were scaling really fast, but we were always undercapitalized. So we were, days away from, we had a 150-person staff. And I'm dialing for dollars,
Just
trying to make
always-
payroll for that
Always
week.
raising money.
And you're constantly raising money, and then you're, working with customers and employees. And so it was definitely a challenge. But at the same time, it was extremely rewarding to build something that had such a positive impact, and to build it in a place that desperately needed it.
So you were doing solar. You mentioned you worked on it for yourself back in the 80s.
In the 90s.
In the 90s. Okay,
Yeah.
I was off. So in the 90s. So you were doing solar before solar was cool. Right now, everybody's focused on it, but you're somebody who's been preparing, and right now there's a big push toward it, obviously. So you're in a perfect position to really help lead this forward.
Well, there's just so much momentum in the space right now. And so I think Taylor mentioned I also am on a board and help run a traditional solar company. And they're killing it. They're growing extremely fast. They sell the traditional door-to-door model, but they've got sales guys going door-to-door who will earn a couple $1 million this year.
Wow.
So
Amazing.
So the momentum's bigger than it's ever been.
It's growing extremely fast, and I think we're finally at this point where people are beginning to look at it, and not with a little less skepticism, and they're actually beginning to shop. Okay, I want to put solar on. What's my best option?
It's a more thoughtful process now
Yeah.
than it ever
Well,
has
and
been.
I've talked to a lot of people that are in the camp of, well, with fairly new technology like this, I don't want to be the first category of buyers. Like, I want to wait till the kinks are ironed out, and I'll jump in later. I kind of tend to be that way. You know, when new stuff hits the market, like let's see how it goes, and I want to get the 2.0 version of it.
Sure.
You know, costs come down, and they work through the challenges.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people.
Yeah,
in that
I mean,
area.
right now the theoretical limit on photovoltaic efficiency is about 26 to 28%. we can convert about 26 to 20% of the energy hitting the panel into electricity.
And what is it on traditional?
That's any type of photovoltaic.
Anything, okay.
Today, our panels are producing somewhere in the 21% range, and we're doing it at a manufacturing cost per watt. This isn't the Halee panel, but the industry in general, manufacturing cost per watt of probably in the 20 to 30 cents per watt range.
Okay.
10 years ago, that was $2 to $3 a watt.
Oh, wow.
20 years ago it was $30 a watt. And
Oh,
so that cost curve is really steep and has come down really fast. And at this point, the majority of the cost is just the commodity cost of silicon, the commodity cost of glass, the commodity cost of the adhesives that go into it. When we designed Halee, one of the big things, to your point about early adopters, was we wanted to design or de-risk the technology risk out of it by using technology that was proven and tried. And so our modules are polycrystalline module. Our glass is the same glass that's used in solar today. Our manufacturing process is the same process that's used in manufacturing today. And so our modules aren't any different other than the form factor than what you see on a traditional roof today. So we try to de-risk the technology risk out of it, the technical risk out of it, by utilizing what's been developed and been proven. And I think that's where a lot of companies really struggle, is they want to innovate, and they want to innovate so bad that they go so far out in front of everything that it's hard for them to actually
too far.
Yeah, they go a little bit too far out,
Yeah.
and so it's hard for them to actually create a business that scales and they can do there. So when we look at the competitive space in BIPV today, our closest competitors are selling at 3 times what our cost is, and it's because they're lower scale, they're too far out in front of the technology curve. They're trying to implement new technologies, and then the most notable one, the one that everybody has seen, their solar roof. That's out there, car manufacturer.
Certain electric car manufacturer.
A
certain one.
They're selling for
down the street from me.
5 or 6 times what our cost is.
Right.
And so it's hard to make the economics work as it exists today. I think the only way we're going to get broad adoption is if we can bring the cost of energy down so that it's better than so that you can reduce the cost even more than what you're paying for it to get it from a utility. And most BIPV companies out there just haven't got there.
So you guys have, massive undertakings ahead of you, right? And really big intentions. Several times you've mentioned, your partnerships and things like that. What do you look for when you're looking for the right partner? Because that's one of the most treacherous things in business is you partner with the wrong person, and you're seeing that person and working with that person and relying on that person oftentimes more than your own spouse.
Yeah.
Right. And the entire success or failure of the mission could be based on something this person does. So how do you make those judgment calls? What do you look for in a good partner?
Well, in all recruiting, I have this 4-point matrix that I look at. The first thing I always look at is mission. Mission before domain, mission before anything, because somebody who's really bought into your mission and objective is willing to do a lot more. They're willing to go that extra mile or that extra 10 miles in order to achieve what you need to get
so
done.
Important.
And then I look at intelligence. You try and find people who are smarter than you, and that's not very hard in my case. There's a lot of people who are way smarter than me.
You're being humble.
It's and so we've got engineers who have PhD backgrounds in energy distribution and AI. So our head of hardware development, a kid named Cody Van Cleve, he came out of ASU's Polytechnic School, was in their PhD program for microgrids. Strong mechanical engineering background. We've got an engineer who's just this really quirky guy, but he's super solid on the mechanical and understanding the software interface. Named Sean, we call him Wolfgang. Lynn Nethkin, who runs our software team, again, she's getting her PhD in AI robotics she's just finishing her PhD in AI robotics right now. So hiring people that are extremely intelligent, because in a startup environment, you're never going to do one job. And so you've got to have people who can have the intelligence and the passion to be able to do multiple things and push really hard. And then domain, you look at people with that domain experience. My partner, Dan, he's probably the best person I've ever met at building relationships with people. He's able to open up, and he's super authentic and just able to most people, when they look at, when I talk to him, they feel like, oh, he's trying to sell me something. Dan can have a 10-minute conversation with them, and suddenly they're inviting them for Thanksgiving dinner. And so we've got this really good team of smart people that understand it. And then culture is a big factor there, making sure that you actually want to work with it. But if you get people that are aligned behind the same mission, it's pretty easy to work together.
Right. So the steps were
mission, intelligence, domain, and culture.
Love it.
That's a good question, Taylor. Nice job.
Do what I can.
Yeah,
I try.
I love that, because I love to kind of get into the mindset of other business owners, and obviously you've had a great deal of success in your career, and these are the reasons for it, right? You've kind of created these filters systems that you use and systems. Yeah. So I was just, if you envision where you would love to take Halee, like what your overall objective is, what are some of the big hurdles that you're anticipating, like nearest and maybe a little further down the road?
I think some of the biggest challenges will continue to be the regulatory and utility environment. As we start to scale up, we're suddenly going to have a lot more energy being produced on the rooftop than what they traditionally have. Less than, in Arizona, it's slightly less than 2%. Most states, it's significantly less than 1% of all homes have solar. And so as we start to scale up entire communities with solar, we have to change the way that we look at it. Most solar today is sold in order to offset your energy bill. So if you've got a $100 a month energy bill, they're going to produce enough solar to offset that, which means that they're going to increase the amount of energy being produced. If you have 100 kilowatt hours, we'll just use some round numbers, 100 kilowatt hours of energy required, they're going to sell you a system that produces 150 kilowatt hours, because we're going to sell energy back to the utility in order to be able to offset that energy. You can't produce enough energy during the times of day that you need energy. At night, obviously, we're not producing any energy. Late in the afternoon, when the angle of the sun is low, we're producing very little energy. Depending on what your angle to the sun is and orientation to the sun is, we're producing less energy at specific times of the day. And so a big way, in order to make the economics work historically, we've oversold the systems 120 to 150% of your total energy requirement so that we can sell energy back to the utility. If suddenly we have an entire community with rooftop solar putting energy back onto the grid, it's going to overwhelm the grid. Our grid's not designed for bidirectional flow of energy for the most part. And even today, a lot of times the utilities are getting energy during a time of day when they don't have the demand. And as a result, that energy goes into a substation and burns off as heat. And so they're paying for energy that they can't actually distribute and get paid for. So I think that one of the biggest challenges is going to be to change the paradigm. One of the things when we look at a community, we never want to overbuild the system. We want to try and match what is the amount of energy we can produce during the period of production that will be consumed. Right. So that we're not putting a ton of energy and relying on the economics of putting that energy back onto the grid to make the system work.
So energy storage then.
Energy storage eventually will definitely change that. Right now, the levelized cost of energy, or if we were to compare what a kilowatt hour of energy stored is versus a kilowatt hour of energy bought is, we're about 4 times the cost. So to store energy is about 30 to 40 cents a kilowatt hour. To buy energy is 10 to 15 cents a kilowatt hour. So it still doesn't make sense for broad adoption outside of some niche cases.
Right.
But that cost curve is coming down significantly. When that cost curve comes down more, then we'll have enough where we can store energy. We can produce a significant amount of energy during the day. We can store it, use it at night. There's always going to be the demand for utility companies, but if we can reduce our reliance on them by 40, 50, 60%, we can have a pretty significant impact on the environment. And most utility companies won't have to. They can decommission some of their older power plants that are more pollutant. they can shift to more efficient and easier to scale up models.
Well, and they're
when
free
there is
to
demand.
invest. They're free to invest in these same new technologies that other people are, right? So
Exactly.
no, that makes sense too. I want to jump back into kind of your upbringing, and were you raised as an entrepreneur? Were you around other entrepreneurs, or was it just something that was, you were the only one in your family? How were you raised?
Just decided to buy a business at
Yeah.
15 one
Yeah,
day.
like,
out of
how
the
did
blue.
that happen?
I think in the 7th grade, they did that. They did the, what do you want to be when you grow up? And
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I said management consultant. I'm pretty sure
was
in the
wearing a
7th grade,
suit.
I was-
Tyler's an anomaly here.
so.
Yeah.
Definitely.
But I had an older some older siblings who were very entrepreneurial, and so we just talked a lot about, how do you build businesses. I remember, I think it was probably 9 or 10 years old. My dad was trying to get me to start a tire changing business.
Couldn't even drive.
Yeah. And so he just thought it was a
Great.
really good idea, and so we've always had those conversations. And my dad's always been really entrepreneurial. He's, after the real estate crash, he decided, well, I'm gonna focus on 2 areas. He had a large construction company up to the 1980s, and then the S&L crash in the 80s.
Yep.
He scaled that back quite a bit. But he's always had this idea that you live off of your job, you retire off of your projects. And so in the back of my mind, that's always been there.
the
and
thesis.
something that we did.
Yeah. No, that's cool.
But there is something to be said about growing up in it. So my daughter today is chief of staff for a startup in Utah. She's on her 3rd startup. And I was talking with the CEO one day, and he says, she's 23 years old at the time, 24 years old. And she just had these innate abilities. But she started interning at my companies in China when she was 13. And she started, coming to...
They don't care about child labor over there the way they do here.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they just let it go.
Exactly.
Love it.
Well, her training
But she
started
has
early
this.
on.
She
Yeah,
has
absolutely.
this mentality around,
Love it.
and all my kids do have this mentality around. If you want it, you create it. You're not waiting for somebody else to give it to you.
Right.
And so,
So that's the culture.
entrepreneurship-
That's the culture that you grew up in. Your kids are growing up
Yeah.
in, and it's contagious.
That's the real. I think that's the real generational wealth. Like I always tell people that
Yeah.
the biggest advantage that wealthy families give to their kids over other families is not the financial aspect. It's the mentalities that got them there.
Right.
When you make that knowledge generational, like you've done with your kids, it's awesome because it just continues to perpetuate itself.
Because
It's
you
pretty
could
cool.
lose all of your wealth.
Oh
today.
yeah.
You'll get it back.
Yeah. I
That's
never
the
have any
abundance
concern.
That's the
yeah,
mindset you have.
Yeah,
You'll get it
absolutely.
back.
Yeah, and I remember, early in my career thinking, well, I have this goal, and then you'd achieve that and be like, okay, now my goals are a little bit bigger, and a lot of times they were monetary. I wanted the BMW, or I wanted the airplane, or I wanted the car, or the house or boat or whatever it was, and then pretty soon it was, well, how it became, how big of an impact can I have? What are the opportunities to do more than just
Yeah, that's the next
Make
level.
money.
to make money?
When did that shift happen for you? What caused that? Can you remember back to that? Was there a specific event, or is it
so-
something that happened gradually?
I was at I think I was about 24 years old, 25 years old, and I was at in a corporate job, and I had read a book about Africa. And I thought to myself, I want to do something in Africa. I don't know what it is. I want to do something in Africa. I just fell in love with this idea of doing something in Africa. And so I called a bunch of NGOs, said, look, I've got 2 weeks of vacation. I'm willing to donate 2 weeks of vacation to come over and just tell me what you need. And they all said, yeah, it doesn't really work that way. We can't, if you're just one person, you're going to come over for 2 weeks. It's not a vacation. We can't make it work. But at the time I was running the business that we were spinning out of, this particular conglomerate, was a travel and expense management software technology. They spent about $1 billion a year on travel. About 400 million of that was air travel. And on an annual basis, they would spoil about $30 million in unused airline tickets. So I went to the executive committee, and I said, look, I want to take these airline tickets that get spoiled. I want to go to the airlines, try and negotiate some value out of it. And I want to create an employee opportunity for employees to go over and spend 2 weeks in Africa.
Oh, what
Brilliant.
a good
That's cool.
idea!
And so we did. And the first year we did about 75 people. Then the next year we did about 150 people. And then I got sold off as part of this transaction, and I left. And so it grew to about 300 people, but then it died after about 2 years because the driver, being me, was gone.
Yeah.
And I learned that philanthropy can't work because eventually the driver's going to go away, whether it's money or it's resource or it's an individual. Eventually the driver's going to go away. And so you got to create the sustainable solution around business that drives that benefit.
Yeah.
So about 10 years ago, I decided to get really involved in social impact, and I teach a module for an entrepreneurship class at ASU around social impact. And my view is that every startup should be an impact company. And there's 3 types of impact companies. There's an offset like Tom's Shoes, where you're going to do a product for product donation.
Right.
Most corporate programs today do some type of a corporate donation where they're going to take some percentage of profits and donate them. The most impactful companies are those that take a social problem and integrate that into the solution that they're creating.
Right.
And so for Halee, that was kind of like the pinnacle for us was how do we create a solution that not only could be extremely profitable, can return huge dividends to our investors, but at the same time address and solve a significant social issue. And so it was about 10 years ago that I got really involved and set on a path to just focus on how do we create social impact companies that have a direct effect on whatever social problem we're trying to solve.
Love it.
Yeah, that's it's a really nice insight into your mind to see how it's working and what the way you're building businesses. I don't know, I think it's great.
Well,
It's great.
The one thing I tell entrepreneurs all the time is that set aside the altruistic aspect of an impact company. My last company in China, our first client was Apple. I never would have gotten in the doors at Apple had I not been coming through the side door through their sustainability organization. We're sitting down citing the contract. It's a $2 million contract, and the procurement guy is asking me, he says, "How did you even get in here? You're a 13-person startup in China. We never work with anybody your size because we're afraid we'll crush you." And it was because the sustainability organization, they were desperate for ways to find investment and way that they could affect their supply chain workforce. And we provided a solution for it. But I never would have been able to get that. I never would have gotten some of the investors. Our first $4 million in investment came from family offices who were impact-minded. They wanted to do something. They didn't want to just give their money to charity. They didn't want to give their money to a museum. They didn't want their name on a school. They wanted to do something that was tangible and actually had a significant impact. And so impact investors, whether it's customers or investors or employees in the recruiting process. And so set aside the altruistic aspect of it. There's tangible benefits to create an impact company just from the advantages that you get of having that social mission.
Well, I think at the end of the day, like in large portion, dollars received is usually just a reflection of impact in the economy. And sometimes it's pure dollar, but more often than not, there's some sort of social benefit. And even if it's, companies that maybe typically we associate with just being a pure profit company, really their mission behind the product or the service they provide is really just to change people's lives. So when you're advising entrepreneurs to get out there and get started, do you tell them to look for, a need first or focus on a product first? Or how do you, because those are 2 very different approaches, right? How do you advise people get started?
The first thing is, I think it's something that you have to be personally affected by.
Right.
It's really hard to go out and it's really in vogue right now at B schools to create these search funds. So Harvard, if you graduate from Harvard's entrepreneurship program right now, they give you $300,000 and it's a search company, and you go out and you find a company that you want to build. And a lot of these entrepreneurs that are going through this process, they're trying to find everything that's new or unique or that's trendy. And so they're creating replicas of Twitter, or they're creating replicas of whatever is popular out there and whatever is growing.
That's not solving anything.
Instead of stepping back and saying, this is a problem for me. For solar, I wanted solar on my house. I just didn't want a rack-mounted solar. And so I wanted to create something that I thought was unique. I wanted to create something that was aesthetically pleasing. And I wanted to do it in a way that was financially incentivizing to me as the consumer, to a builder, to somebody else, so that it could develop broader adoption. So the first thing I always tell them is you can't just go out and try and build something based on what somebody else has thought of.
Right.
You have to be personally affected by whatever it is that you're trying to build. And that's the only way that you're going to have the passion and the fortitude to be able to really put in the time necessary to figure out how to make it work.
Love it. So our producers are telling us that we need to wrap it up soon. But I want to ask you the question we ask everybody: if you had to leave 2 pieces of advice behind for the world to know and for your kids to know, what would those 2 pieces of advice be if today was your last day?
I think for the world, it would be just be really intentional in whatever it is that you're doing. And so if you're building a business, be really intentional about the way that you're going about it. Whether it's raising money, be intentional about your cap table. Whether it's creating a product, be really intentional about that product and what impact it's going to have. And so really, I think a lot of times companies fail or entrepreneurs fail because they are waiting for somebody else or some other current to take them to where they want to go instead of being intentional about figuring out how to get there. For my kids, I've always said that the old adage, find something you love to do and you'll never work a day in your life, is BS. Because every job is hard.
Yeah.
You may love your job every day,
right,
but there are days where you can't stand it.
It's going to suck if it's going to suck.
And yeah. I've always had this little sign that I kept, hidden in my desk that said this business would be great if it weren't for all these damn employees and customers. Yeah. But
That's good.
Recognize that whatever you do,
right,
you have to be passionate about it. You have to be excited about it. But recognize that there are going to be days where it just sucks. And so figure out, how do you get past those days? How do you push through the hard times? Because eventually the good times, well, they may not outweigh the hard times in duration or frequency. They'll definitely outweigh it in terms of motivation.
Love it. Well, thanks for being on here with us today. That's all the time we have today. Please like, follow, subscribe, do all the social media stuff. This is the Massive Impact Show. We'll have you back next time. See you soon.